All right, welcome to the deep dive. So, every year when March rolls around, we are just bombarded
Yeah.
with all things green. Green clothes, green beer, green rivers, green bagels, green milkshakes. I mean,
Great everything.
green everything. You get the idea. But what we wanted to do today is kind of dig into,
The meaning behind it all.
yeah, exactly. It's so easy to forget that, for a lot of people, I'm talking Irish citizens, St. Patrick's Day is not just about dyeing everything green. And
Public intoxication.
yeah, exactly. It's their national holiday. Everything shuts down. It's a bank holiday. And a lot of people will be in mass. It's a holy day.
So we kind of have these two sides of the same coin, the global party and the deeply rooted religious and national observance.
Right. And in this deep dive, we want to bridge that gap a little bit, explore the history and the culture behind St. Patrick's Day, looking at both the more secular celebrations and the traditional Irish traditions. We're going to tackle the big questions like, who was St. Patrick?
How did this guy, this one man, become such a huge figure in Irish history?
Really huge. So let's start at the very beginning. I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn that, St. Patrick wasn't actually Irish.
Yeah. That's one of the most common misconceptions about him. The historical evidence actually points to him being born in Britain sometime in the 5th century.
Okay, so a Brit, not an Irishman. How did he even end up in Ireland in the first place?
So imagine this. You're a teenager, maybe 16 years old, living in Britain, and then bam, Irish raiders capture you. You're taken to Ireland as a slave.
Right.
We think this happened sometime between 401 and 500 AD.
Wow.
Yeah. He was then sold into slavery in this region called Dalriada, and he spent the next 6 years of his life tending sheep.
6 years as a slave, so far from home.
Yeah.
That must have been incredibly tough.
Oh, absolutely. It was brutal. But, and this is really interesting, it was during this time that his whole world changed. He converted to Christianity. And not just like casually converted. He became incredibly devoted.
Really devoted.
Yeah, super devoted. I mean, in his own writing, the Confessio, he talks about how he would pray constantly, hundreds of times a day, even before sunrise, out in the woods, on the mountains. His faith really became his lifeline during that really dark time.
I can only imagine. But how did he actually escape?
So according to him, it was a dream that spurred his escape. He heard a voice telling him, "It's time to go home. Your ship is ready."
Sounds like a pretty straightforward plan.
Except there was one problem. The ship was like 200 miles away, and he had no idea how to get there.
200 miles. And back then, that's not exactly a quick trip.
Right. But he trusted the dream and just took off, running away from his master after 6 years.
So he sets off on this 200-mile journey. What was that like? I mean,
It was a rough one. When he finally reached the coast, he had this setback. He was trying to find passage, get on a ship, and these pagan sailors, they basically told him to get lost. But he says that he walked away, started praying, and all of a sudden they changed their minds and let him on board.
wow, what a turn of events.
It is. And the journey wasn't over yet. It was a 3-day trip on the water, followed by 28 days on foot. They were walking through what he describes as deserted territory, probably somewhere in Britain, maybe even Gaul. Supplies ran out, and he said his companions urged him to pray for food.
What happened then?
Well, according to his account, a herd of swine appeared, like out of nowhere. They were saved. He even talks about a second shorter time he was taken captive after all of that.
You can't make this stuff up.
You really can't. But eventually, he did make it home to his family in Britain.
After all of that, you'd think he'd want to, stay put and maybe never think about Ireland again. But that's not how the story ends, is it?
Nope. He had another dream, another really vivid one. And in this dream, he's given a letter. The heading on the letter says, "The Voice of the Irish."
The voice of the Irish.
Yes. It's from a man named Victoricus. And in the dream, he hears these voices. They're calling to him from like a wood, I think he called it the Wood of Folklet. And they're begging him to come back to Ireland, to walk among them again.
Okay, so now this dream, it's calling him back to the place where he was enslaved.
Exactly. And he felt this really strong call, a spiritual pull to go back and spread Christianity.
So at this point, he's decided to go back. Did he just, pack his bags and get on the next boat?
Well, not quite. He decided to dedicate himself to religious study. He traveled all the way to France, to Auxerre, and he studied under this well-known bishop, Saint Germanus. He was there for years, learning and preparing for his mission.
Wow, talk about dedication.
Oh, yeah. He was ordained as a deacon around 418 AD, and then a few years later, he was consecrated as a bishop.
So now he's a bishop. What happened next?
Well, Pope Celestine I heard about him and was impressed with him, and so he officially sent Patrick back to Ireland to spread Christianity.
That's quite a journey. I mean, he goes from being a captive to a missionary, spreading the very faith that gave him comfort during his captivity.
It's pretty incredible. And when he arrived back in Ireland, it wasn't all smooth sailing. I mean, he landed around March 25th, 433 AD. Some accounts say he landed at a place called Slane. And some people resisted him in his teachings, but he kept at it. He traveled all over Ireland, preaching, writing, baptizing people.
And did he write much? Like, are there any of his writings we can still read today?
Yeah, there are. We have his Confessio, which is kind of like a spiritual autobiography, and also his letter to Coroticus. They give us this incredible insight into his life and his work.
I bet they do. Now, we've all heard about St. Patrick and the shamrock. Is there any truth to that story, or is it just a legend?
Well, the story is that he used this three-leaf shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, three persons in one God. It's a pretty enduring image. And apparently he used that image of the three leaves on one stem to explain this really complex idea to people who didn't know anything about Christianity.
That's a pretty clever way to explain it using something so familiar.
And, over time, that shamrock became associated with Irish Christian pride. And then, of course, that morphed into wearing green on St. Patrick's Day.
Makes sense.
The funny thing is we actually don't know for sure what exact plant he used. It might have been wood sorrel or maybe even clover.
Either way, it worked. So what would you say was the overall impact of his missionary work in Ireland? Like, what did he actually achieve?
He really changed the landscape of Ireland. It's widely accepted that he set up a whole bunch of churches and converted thousands of people to Christianity. We even have some sources that suggest he converted entire kingdoms. He worked for 40 years, preaching and converting people all over the island, often putting himself in really dangerous situations as he tried to deal with all these different Celtic tribes.
So he was pretty fearless, it sounds like.
I'd say so. And the fact that he had been a slave in Ireland, I think that made a big difference. He understood the people, and they could probably sense his genuine desire to help them.
I think you're right. Now let's move on to how St. Patrick's Day became this big religious holiday in Ireland.
Well, the thing to remember is that the Irish have been observing St. Patrick's Day as a religious holiday for over 1,000 years.
1,000 years? That's incredible.
It is. Traditionally, it was a much more, how should I say, low-key affair than what we often see today. People would go to church in the morning and have these simple traditional meals with their families, things like cabbage and bacon.
Sounds pretty traditional.
Yeah, and March 17th is traditionally thought to be the day he died back in 461 AD, so the date itself has this really deep meaning.
Okay, so it was very much a religious day, rooted in his death. What about the parades and the festivals that we associate with St. Patrick's Day today? Have those always been part of the tradition in Ireland?
So those huge public festivals, the ones you see in Dublin with all the music and dancing and costumes, the street theater, the Irish language stuff, those are a bit more recent. They developed over time.
So the religious observance is ancient, and then the big celebrations came later.
Yeah. And it's amazing how it's evolved, even within Ireland. But then you also have this whole other thing going on St. Patrick's Day, going global.
And of course, we can't talk about that without talking about America. It's huge over there.
It really is. The fact that this holiday, this religious holiday, is now celebrated all over the world as this big, joyous expression of Irish culture is pretty remarkable.
It's a huge cultural
It's a
shift.
huge cultural shift. I mean, did you know that the very first recorded St. Patrick's Day parade wasn't even in Ireland?
Oh, it wasn't.
It was in St. Augustine, Florida, back in 1601. It was a Spanish colony then.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And then, of course, when the early Irish settlers came to America, they brought the tradition with them.
And that's where it really took off, right? Especially with all the Irish immigration over the years.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, those early celebrations, the ones in Boston in 1737 and in New York City in 1762, they were really important for those early Irish communities. It was a way for them to connect with their heritage, to feel a sense of belonging in this new place. And New York still claims to have the largest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world.
I can believe it. But even before that, what about those stories, the legends that surround St. Patrick?
Yeah.
Like the one about him driving all the snakes out of Ireland.
Oh, yeah, the snakes. Well, most people understand that one
That's right.
very symbolically.
Yeah, like he didn't literally drive snakes out of Ireland because Ireland never had snakes in the first place. It's more about him getting rid of paganism. And some people even say that snakes represent evil in the Bible, so maybe it's connected to that too.
Interesting.
It is. And then you have other legends, like him raising 33 people from the dead,
Hmm.
or him magically providing food for sailors with a herd of swine. Again, it's that image of the swine that keeps popping up. The swine seem to be a recurring theme. But do people still make pilgrimages to sites associated with St. Patrick today?
Oh, yeah, they do. People still climb Croagh Patrick, the mountain where he supposedly fasted for 40 days. And then there's St. Patrick's Purgatory, a place of retreat on an island in Lough Derg that's famous for its 3-day pilgrimage, which is supposed to be really intense.
It's pretty amazing how much his legacy still resonates. One last question. Was St. Patrick ever firmly canonized as a saint by the church?
You know, that's a really interesting point. He actually wasn't. Back in the early days of Christianity, there wasn't really a formal process for making someone a saint. It was more about popular acclaim. If people believed someone was a saint because of their holy life, or their martyrdom, or the miracles attributed to them, then they were basically a saint.
So he was a saint by popular demand.
That's one way to put it.
Well, I think it's clear that St. Patrick was a pretty incredible figure. You know, a former slave who went back to the land of his captivity and changed the course of history.
Absolutely. I mean, he's considered the patron saint of Ireland, the national apostle, and his writings, especially his Confessio, they show us this really humble and devoted man, but also someone with incredible strength and resilience.
It's amazing how much one person can accomplish, even after facing such hardship.
It is.
So to wrap things up, it's clear that there are these two sides to St. Patrick's Day. You have the global party, the green beer, the parades, but then you also have the deeply religious and national holiday in Ireland.
And they both matter, right? They both speak to different aspects of his legacy, and I think that's pretty fascinating.
It is. It just goes to show how historical figures and events can be interpreted and celebrated in so many different ways, across cultures, across time. And for listeners out there, I think it's worth thinking about the traditions we all participate in. How have they changed over time? What do those changes tell us about ourselves and how we view the past?
That's a great question.
The great question. Anyway, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into St. Patrick's Day. We'll see you next time.